Every clock on your phone, every meeting invite, every flight departure board assumes the world is divided into neat 1 hour slices. But who decided that? And why did it happen exactly when it did and almost not at all? The system we treat as natural law was invented by a railroad engineer who couldn't get anyone to listen to him for 15 years, forced through by a crisis that killed people, and nearly replaced by a French rival system that would have carved the world up from a completely different meridian. The clocks we set without thinking are the scar tissue of that fight. To understand why time zones had to be invented at all, you have to understand how time worked before trains existed, which is to say, it worked differently in every single town. In 1840, when you stepped off the main street of Bristol, England, your watch was showing a time roughly 10 minutes behind a clock in London because Bristol sits about 2 degrees of longitude west of the capital. That gap is real. The sun rises and sets 10 minutes later in Bristol than it does in London. For most of human history, that was fine. Towns set their clocks by the local sun, and since nobody was moving fast enough for the difference to matter, nobody cared. But then the Great Western Railway opened a line connecting London and Bristol in 1841, and suddenly you had a passenger traveling between two towns with different local times on a single scheduled timetable. The railway initially published arrivals and departures using London time at one end and Bristol time at the other. Conductors carried two watches. Passengers missed trains. Station masters argued with each other over which clock was correct. The Great Western Railway resolved this for its own purposes by simply declaring that all of its stations would run on London time starting in November 1840, one of the first deliberate acts of standardizing time across physical distance. But it was a private fix for a private company. Outside the railway, Bristol still kept Bristol time. The post office kept its own schedule. Courts set hearings by local sun. There was no mechanism, no authority, and frankly no consensus that any of this needed to change. The tension that was building wasn't really about minutes. It was about who had the right to decide what time it was. The person who first proposed a real solution was Sandford Fleming, a Scottish-born Canadian railway engineer who in 1876 missed a train in County Donegal, Ireland, because a printed timetable listed the time as AM when it should have been PM, or depending on which account you read, because the local station time and the timetable time were simply different. Either way, Fleming sat in that station for hours, and somewhere in the irritation of that wait, he started writing. His proposal, published formally in 1879, was elegant and radical: divide the entire Earth into 24 zones, each 1 hour apart, each tied to a meridian line. Within each zone, everyone keeps the same time. Cross a zone boundary, you adjust by exactly 1 hour. No more Bristol versus London arithmetic. No more conductor with two watches. Fleming took his idea to the scientific societies, the British government, the Canadian government, and anyone who would hold still long enough to read a pamphlet. He was mostly ignored. The railways in North America were operating on a patchwork of at least 53 different railroad times by 1880. Each major rail hub had essentially invented its own time, and they overlapped and contradicted each other in ways that made scheduling a genuine operational nightmare. In cities like Pittsburgh, travelers moving between two train stations a few blocks apart sometimes encountered a 28-minute time difference because the two stations served different rail lines that kept different clocks. This wasn't an abstraction. On November 12, 1853, two trains on the Providence and Worcester Railroad collided head-on near Providence, Rhode Island, killing 14 people. The root cause was a scheduling confusion tied directly to inconsistent timekeeping between stations. The railroads understood by then that the problem was real. What they couldn't agree on was whose solution to adopt and who would give up their local time standard in the process. The lock-in came in two steps, and the second one is the one that actually stuck. On November 18, 1883, a day American newspapers called the Day of Two Noons, the major North American railroad companies, coordinating through the General Time Convention, simultaneously reset their clocks to four standardized time zones across the continent: Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. There was no act of Congress. There was no presidential order. A private industry consortium simply decided to make it happen, and because the railroads were the arteries of commerce in 1883, most of the country followed within months. Some cities resisted. Detroit refused to switch for years and ended up on a different time than its neighboring towns. Bangor, Maine kept local solar time until 1887, but the economic gravity of a unified rail network was too strong. If you wanted to ship goods, travel, or receive mail on the railroad's schedule, you operated on railroad time. The global version came the following year. In October 1884, the International Meridian Conference convened in Washington, D.C. with representatives from 25 nations, summoned specifically to establish a universal prime meridian, the zero line from which all time zones would be measured. After days of argument, the delegates voted on October 22, 1884 to establish the Greenwich Meridian, running through the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, England as the prime meridian of the world. The vote was 22 in favor, 1 opposed, and 2 abstentions. The one opposed vote was from San Domingo. France and Brazil abstained. The decision displaced every other candidate meridian. Paris, Cadiz, Washington, Jerusalem had all been proposed at various points, and locked Greenwich into the architecture of global timekeeping permanently. Fleming's 24-zone system with Greenwich at its center was the template that all subsequent national adoptions followed. France abstained at the 1884 conference, and that abstention wasn't diplomatic courtesy. France had its own prime meridian, the Paris Meridian, running through the Paris Observatory, which French cartographers and navigators had been using as their zero line since 1667. For over 2 centuries, French maps measured everything from Paris. The Paris Meridian had as much claim to legitimacy as Greenwich. More, in some respects, France had been producing standardized maps, using it for longer than Britain had been using Greenwich systematically. The French argument, not entirely without merit, was that Greenwich was chosen not because of any scientific superiority, but because Britain operated the largest share of the world's shipping and merchant marine. Roughly 72% of the world's commercial shipping in 1884 already used sea charts based on Greenwich. The choice, France argued, was commercial leverage dressed up as scientific consensus. France continued to use the Paris Meridian officially on its maps until 1911, and resisted the Greenwich-based time zone system in its legal frameworks until 1978, when French law finally adopted Coordinated Universal Time, which is itself measured from Greenwich, as the official basis for French Standard Time. For nearly a century, the country that abstained from the original vote quietly operated a parallel system, and then one by one, the practical demands of international aviation, telecommunications, and trade made the holdout untenable. The Paris Meridian still runs through the French capital. You can walk it. There are bronze medallions set in the pavements of Paris marking its path, 135 of them, placed in 1994 by Dutch artist Jan Dibbets as a monument to the meridian that almost won. Most Parisians walk over them every day without knowing what they are. Here is what that whole history left behind in your daily life. When your phone automatically updates to local time as your plane lands, it is executing a system that a frustrated engineer designed in a train station in 1876 because he missed a connection. The 1-hour increment, not 30 minutes, not 2 hours, not the 15-minute intervals that some countries still use today, like India and Nepal and parts of Australia, reflects a compromise between astronomical precision and the practical simplicity that railroad schedulers would actually accept. The choice of Greenwich as the zero line means that the international date line on the opposite side of the planet runs through the middle of the Pacific Ocean rather than through the middle of a continent, which is why it zigzags so strangely around island nations that didn't want to be split across 2 calendar days. That zigzag is the direct echo of a diplomatic vote in Washington in 1884. And then there is the stranger fossil. Coordinated Universal Time, the master clock that all digital systems, financial markets, GPS satellites, and internet protocols synchronize to, is abbreviated UTC, not CUT, which would be the logical English acronym, not TUC, the French acronym for Temps Universal Coordinate, UTC. A compromise abbreviation that belongs to neither language, chosen in 1970 by the International Telecommunication Union precisely so that no single country could claim the standard bore their name. Even in the abbreviation, the old argument is still running. The next time your calendar app proposes a meeting in UTC-5, you're looking at the end of a 200-year argument about who gets to own the center of time, and nobody won it cleanly.